Fiefs, lands within a sanjak fell usually into three categories. First, there was land that was privately owned. Second, there was land that formed part of a trust, and third, there was land that was at the disposal of the sultan. Private lands were relatively few, since the sultans aimed to keep as much land as possible under their own control, but also because Muslim inheritance laws would insist on the division of the property among the heirs on the death of the owner. Families preferred, therefore, not to keep landed property in this form. Trust land, on the other hand, was extensive throughout the empire. This was land or property whose revenues went to support the cause, which the founder had nominated in the trust deed, typically a mosque, hospice, bridge or fountain. The revenues could also, however, go to support the founder, his or her family and descendants. And, since trusts were made in perpetuity and their properties were indivisible, this was the legal form in which families often preferred to hold their lands. 27 The most extensive category of land within most Ottoman sanyaks was, however, beglik or miri. Both these words have the sense simply of pertaining to, or at the disposal of the ruler, and it was these lands the sultan allocated as fiefs. The sanjak governors did not, it seems, have rights of entry into lands which were private property, or which belonged to trusts, but only into miri lands. In this sense, an Ottoman sanjak consisted of a conglomeration of fiefs in a particular area, whose holders served in war under the standard of the sanjak governor, and having within it certain areas where the governor had no authority. By 1500, the terminology of Ottoman fief holding had stabilized. The term for the smallest fiefs, with a value of up to 20,000 akshas per year, was Timar. A larger fief, with a value of up to 100,000 akshas, was a subashilik, known more commonly after about 1500 as a zemat. The largest holding, with an annual value of 100,000 akshas, or more, was a has. A typical Timar consisted of a village or group of villages, and the fields around them, which the sultan had allocated to a cavalryman, who had the right to collect the taxes from his peasants and, in return, provided the sultan with military service. In addition, he was responsible for maintaining order on his land, with the right usually to pocket half the fines for misdemeanors. This duty clearly required him to reside at least within his sanjak, and usually on the Timar itself, where he would also enjoy a plot of land for his own use. The Timar holder did not, however, own the land from which he drew his revenues. Rather, he held it as a grant which the sultan could revoke, and would do so, especially if the cavalryman failed to appear for military service. The allocation of land as Timars was thus a way of maintaining a large and permanent force of cavalrymen, whom the sultan could call upon to serve in the army during each campaigning season. It was these Timar holders who made up the bulk of the Ottoman armies. From the late 14th century to the late 16th, the origins of the system clearly lie in the pre-Ottoman period. Most notably, perhaps, the Byzantine emperors began, from the late 11th century, to allocate land as fiefs to support soldiers. They did not, however, give the soldiers ownership of the land, and the grants were revocable. The Greek word for such a fief was pronoia, and the appearance of this term in the 14th and 15th centuries in Serbia and in Venetian-held territory in Albania suggests that fief holding on the Byzantine model had become widespread in the Balkan Peninsula. 28 It seems probable, therefore, that when Osman and Orhan made their conquests in Byzantine Bithynia and Thrace, they would have found the system of pronoias intact, and that as Ottoman territory spread westwards beyond the former Byzantine realms, their successors would have encountered similar patterns of fief holding. In origin, therefore, the Ottoman Timar seems to have been an adaptation of the Byzantine pronoia. 29 Both pronoias and Timars were grants of land made by the sovereign to a soldier. Both were revocable, and in neither case did the soldier become the owner of the land. There are also striking similarities between vocabularies of Byzantine and Ottoman fief holding. The Greek word pronoia means literally care, attention. The Turkish term Timar means exactly the same thing. The Greek word for a peasant holding on a pronoia is zugarian, meaning literally yoke, pair, of oxen. The Turkish terms for a similar holding, çift or boyunduruk, mean the same. The Byzantine unit of land measurement of 40 paces is strema. The word means literally twisting with reference to the measuring rope. The Ottoman equivalent for a plot 40 paces square is donum, a word which means, literally, turning an opos. The Ottoman term for incidental taxes due to a Timar holder is bada hava or wind of the air, a phrase which would be puzzling were the Byzantine terms for a similar group of taxes not air or erikon. These terms, which are fundamental to Ottoman fief holding, suggest a Byzantine model for the system. There is other evidence that the Ottoman system of fief holding was an adaptation of pre-Ottoman practice. In much of central and southeastern Anatolia, fief holding did not conform to the pattern found in Rumelia, western Anatolia and elsewhere in the empire, where all the revenues of a Timar went to support a cavalryman. Instead, the revenues were divided. One portion, including usually the imposts on the land itself, went to a cavalryman who, like a normal Timar holder, had the obligation to perform military service. This portion was at the disposal of the Sultan to allocate and revoke at will. The other portion, which usually included the tithe on crops, belonged to the private owner who could dispose of it as he or she wished. The origins of this system of divided revenues clearly lie in the pre-Ottoman period and, since the area in which it was in operation corresponds more or less to the extent of the realms of the Anatolian Seljuks, it is reasonable to assume that it was an inheritance from the Seljuks and their successor principalities. Ottoman cadastral registers also offer scraps of evidence that point to this origin. A register from the time of Mehmed II, for example, records that 2 private portions of revenue had been bought from the Seljuk treasury and sultan in 1284 and 1285. Another register of 1,520 notes that the Seljuk Sultan Aladdin II had granted the private portion in 1,255. Ottoman registers record similar transactions as having occurred under the Karamanids and the Akoyanlis, successors to the Seljuks in south-central and southeastern Anatolia. The Ottomans seem, in fact, to have maintained more or less intact the system that they found. 30. There were therefore 2 types of Timar, the one where all the taxes went to support a cavalryman, the other where a portion went to support a private owner. The first type is a descendant of the Byzantine pronoia, the second continues the practices of the Anatolian Seljuks. Not surprisingly, when the sultans introduced fiefholding to newly conquered lands, where it had not existed previously, as in Hungary after 1541, it was the first type of Timar, with no private owners, that they introduced. The allocation of land as Timars provided the sultan with a standing cavalry army, and also, since the cavalrymen themselves collected the taxes from their Timars, relieved the treasury of the task of raising revenues and paying salaries. Nonetheless, the system presented its own problems. First, there was the question of mobilization. When the sultan ordered a campaign, he needed to know the number of troops available, and the obligations of each man in providing horses, weapons, tents and armed retainers. He needed also to be certain that the men would assemble and join the main army at the appointed place. All these things were difficult when the cavalrymen were scattered throughout the empire. Second, there was the danger that the cavalrymen, particularly in remote areas, would convert their Timars to private property, which would then slip from the sultan's control. The government was careful to prevent this happening. It did so in the first place through bureaucratic surveillance. Immediately upon the conquest of a district, a surveyor made an inventory of its taxable resources, showing how these had been distributed, as Timars to cavalrymen, as zemits to their officers, or as has assigned to the sultan, governors general or sanjak governors. Any problems which the surveyor could not solve, he submitted to the imperial council. The completed survey he would submit to the sultan for scrutiny. Once approved, the land registry office in the capital would codify the results in a detailed register. 31 This typically showed all the towns, villages, hamlets, tribes and cultivated lands in a sanjak. For each settlement or tribe, they would give the names of male heads of household, bachelors and, in some Christian areas, widows, together with the lands which they cultivated. These it would note as a yoke, half a yoke, or less than half a yoke and apos. It also recorded the landless. In addition, the register would show the estimated yield from each tax levied on every community. It would show how these revenues were divided up between fief holders, and the total annual yield of each fief, whether Timar, Zemit or Has. A typical entry in a detailed register would therefore have the heading, Timar of A son of B and Apos. Underneath would be a heading village of X with, beneath it, the name of each male head of household, with an indication of the size of their plot of land. Beneath this, it would list the taxes which the villagers paid, together with their estimated yield, and finally an estimate of the total sum. From the information in these detailed volumes, the Land Registry Office made summary registers, which showed the Timar holders and other beneficiaries of a sanjak's revenues, and the value of their fiefs. These, in turn, provided the information for the muster registers, which listed the names of all the cavalrymen in a sanjak. It was these that allowed the army commander in times of war to check the list against the men who had appeared for service, and to note any absentees. The problem with the detailed registers was that they went out of date almost immediately. The registry dealt with this difficulty, in the first place, by noting changes in the margins. Frequently, for example, there were new appointees to Timars and, in this case, a marginal note would record the name of the new man, together with the date and place of the appointment, in a detailed register of Thessaloniki. From about 1445, for example, a marginal note appears against the Timar of Legato Reiko, died, hanged when he was proved to be a brigand, transferred to his son Crosso, July, 1451. Sofia. Another example from a 1455 register for Skopje notes against the Timar of Musa, retainer of the Marcher Lord, Isa Bey, given to the Janissary, Yusuf of Stanimaka. He renders service to the fortress. 16th of July, 1463. Camp at Kakanik. To this is added, since this Yusuf of Stanimaka committed homicide, this Timar has been taken away and given to the gatekeeper, Kirik Musa, slave of the Sultan. August, 1466. Camp at Prelep. 33. These marginalia were adequate for a few years, but the passing of a generation required the creation of a new register. It became the custom, therefore, every 20 years or so, to make a new register, recording anew all the necessary data. One copy of the register for each Sanjak remained in the registry office in Istanbul. The Sanjak governor held the other. This system of keeping registers enabled the Sultan's government to keep track of the names and the number of Timar holders throughout the empire, and thus also to know the total number of cavalrymen available for war. It also made it possible to check the extent of each cavalryman's obligations. A cavalryman had to bring with him, on campaign, not only a horse, but also his own arms and armor, tents and 1 or 2 armed retainers, the level of his obligations being dependent on the value of the income from his Timar. Many of the registers which survive from the 15th century record these obligations together with the other details of the Timar. For example, a Timar which appears in the Albanian register of 1431 to 2 notes that a certain Abdullah, formerly page of the slipper, to the Sultan, held a Timar worth 310 akshes. For this, he had to present himself on campaign in person, with body armor, 1 man at arms, 1 attendant, and 1 tent and opos. The practice of making such man and tent notes in the registers disappeared in the 16th century, but by then the existence of a general code laying down the obligations of fief holders had rendered them unnecessary. The value of a cavalryman's income, checked against the code, would determine the level of his obligations. 34. The registers were the most important means by which the Sultan surveyed and controlled his Timar holding cavalrymen. The practice itself of allocating land as Timars, on the pattern of Byzantine pronoias, must date from the early decades of the empire, and possibly even from the time of Osman. The practice, however, of making registers developed later. The earliest full and fragmentary registers date from 1431 to 2, but these demonstrate an already developed system of bookkeeping, suggesting that surveyors and clerks had been compiling such registers for several decades at least. In the absence of firm evidence, it is impossible to be certain, but it is likely that the practice began in the reign of Bayezid I, 1389 to 1402. This emerges from a diatribe against the centralization of government under Bayezid, which appears in the popular Ottoman chronicles of the late 15th century. These make the comment that when Hayreddin Chandarli and Kara Rustam came to the Ottoman court, they filled the world with deceit. They invented registers of accounts and began piling up money. When Chandarli Ali became vizier, immorality increased. 35. The Ottomans evidently inherited the system of keeping registers from the Ilkhans, the overlords of Seljuk Anatolia, from 1243. This is evident from the fact that the language of the registers, and of treasury documents in general, is Persian, and from the adoption of the same cipher script for writing numerals as appears in Ilkhanid accounts. The Ottoman registers also show some of the features of Ilkhanid fiscal practices that follow the reforms of Ghazan Khan, 1295 to 1304, 36, notably the concept of the fiscal year, and the use of a single unit of account, in the Ottoman case, the silveraksh. The Timar registers, in particular, assigned to each Timar a notional annual value in akshes, and it was this figure that determined the cavalryman's obligations. These residues of apparently Ilkhanid practice in the registers also suggest that it was Bayezid I who introduced them, since it was he who annexed the former Seljuk and Ilkhanid territories in central and northern Anatolia and, briefly, Karaman. It is possible that it was from the chancelleries that he found in these areas that the Ottomans derived their system. Until the late 16th century, the registers were the primary means of keeping a check on Timar holders. In the late 15th century, however, the Sultan acquired a new means of control. In 1487, during the reign of Bayezid II, a new land and tax survey of the Sanjak of Bursa resulted in the issue of a new register which contained, as an introduction, a law book which laid out in detail the taxes and fines due from the tax-paying subjects of the district to the fief holders. 37 In future, all new registers opened with a similar law book, 38, which could act as a source of reference in establishing the extent of Timar and other fief holders' rights, especially to taxes. In the 16th century, each district came to have its own law book, which underwent a revision with each new survey of the Sanjak and the creation of a new register. The reign of Bayezid II also saw the compilation of a general law book that aimed to summarize the rules, which define membership of the military, that is, the non-tax-paying class, most of whom were Timar holders, services owed by fief holders, the obligations of tax-paying subjects, tax regulations, and other matters, including criminal statutes. This general law book represents a wish to harmonize, as far as possible, the practice of Timar holding throughout the empire. It appeared in its earliest version in the late 1490s. Further recensions followed, until the appearance of the final version in about 1540.39. The function of the law books was presumably to give the practice of Timar holding a statutory framework, and to provide an authoritative source of reference. In case of disputes, it is unlikely, however, that this project was wholly successful since, in many places it is evident that the statutes in the law books are at variance with what appears in the registers. The registers and the law books allowed the Sultan to keep a check on the numbers and identities of fief holders, the value of their fiefs, and the services owed, and the laws governing fief holding, in the empire at large and in each Sanjak. In addition, he came to control, as far as he was able, the manner of appointment. In the 14th and early 15th centuries, the manner of distributing Timars was probably informal and, at least in the border areas, not wholly under the control of the Sultan. Some of the earliest Timar holders would have been survivors from the pre-Ottoman regime who had maintained their status after the Ottoman conquest. Such groups emerged from each phase of Ottoman expansion. 40 The earliest surviving registers from Rumelia show Christian Timar holders. Similarly, the Anatolian registers show large numbers of hereditary fiefs in the possession of families or tribes, sometimes indicating specifically that these had come down from pre-Ottoman times. A register of the province of Karaman, for example, records a group of cavalrymen in the said village, descendants of Yavash Bey, who held the village by virtue of a deed of Mehmed Bey of Karaman. 41 After the annexation of Kurdistan in the early 16th century, the Kurdish lords continued to hold lands as hereditary fiefs in return for military service. However, many Timar holders in the early empire were probably relatives, slaves and followers of the Sultan and his lords. Certainly the Rumelian registers of the 15th century record Timars in the possession of the men of the great marcher lords. The registers of the second half of the 15th century, however, suggest an increasing regularity in the system of appointment and a growing central control, a process which culminated in a series of sultanic decrees between 1531 and 1536, which aimed to regularize the allocation of Timars and to bring it fully under surveillance. In order to do so, it was necessary first to establish who had an entitlement to a Timar. In the first place, there were salary holders at court, in the janissaries or the 6 divisions, or in the households of pashas. As the earliest surviving records show, there had always been Timar holders from these categories. However, 2 decrees from the 1530s, themselves probably revising laws from the time of Bayezid II, try to regularize such appointments by specifying the value of Timars, which they should receive. A gatekeeper of the palace, for example, had an entitlement to a Timar of 15,000 akshas per year, as did certain categories of janissary officer. On the death of a pasha, his steward was to receive a Timar, worth 14,000 akshas, his head gatekeeper, 1, worth 13,000, while his master of the stables and treasurer both received fiefs of 8,000 akshas. For those who were on the Sultan's payroll, transfer from a salaried post to a Timar probably represented a demotion, as it entailed giving up a salary and leaving the palace, which was the most prolific source of patronage. Courtiers and soldiers, who had previously enjoyed a salary, formed a minority of Timar holders, as did the occupiers of hereditary fiefs. The majority were those who had inherited from their fathers. What a son inherited, however, was a right to a Timar in general, rather than to his father's Timar in particular. This right, too, was subject to restrictions, which a decree of 1531 to the Governor-General of Rumelia set out to codify. According to this document, if the holder of a zemat worth 20,000 to 50,000 akshas per year died in battle and had 3 valiant sons, these should receive Timars of 6,000, 5,000 and 4,000 akshas respectively. If the same Zemat holder were to die at home, then 2 of his sons would receive entitlements to fiefs worth 5,000 and 4,000 akshas. The document continues in this way, showing entitlements of heirs to Timars of different values, ending with those whose Timar is worth less than 10,000 akshas. In this case, if the Timar holder dies in battle, 2 valiant sons receive Timars of 3,000 and 2,000 akshas. If he dies at home, both sons receive Timars of 2,000. It is clear from these regulations that not every son had a right to a Timar. If a fief was worth more than 20,000 akshas per year, 3 sons, and if it was worth less than 20,000, 2 sons inherited the right. A decree of 1536 reiterates this last point. However many sons survive him, Timars should be given to 2 of his sons, in accordance with my previous command. An apos, a son with a hereditary right, could occupy a Timar at any age. However, if a Timar holder was still a child, he had to send an armed man to war in his place, and to serve in person on reaching maturity. This the decree of 1536 defines, with the remark that, until that time, any Timar holder over 10 years of age had to go on campaign, but that, now that campaigns are distant, the age of service was 16. The decrees of the 1530s suggest that, by that time, holders of Timars and Zemats had, to some extent, come to form a hereditary caste, with restricted entry. This was a tendency which the decrees aimed to reinforce. The command of 1531, to the Governor-General of Rumelia, reported that sons of ordinary subjects had unlawfully received fiefs and were using their position to extract money and to transgress and interfere in apos. The Imperial Council had confiscated the fiefs of some of these outsiders in apos. However, the decree continues. From March 8, 1531, no one whose Timar was recorded in a register should be referred to as an outsider or have his Timar removed. This established who, from that date onwards, was a member of the military caste. Second, the decree stated clearly which of a fief holder's sons had a right to a Timar, and of what value. Third, the decree tried to stop fraudulent claims. A command of 1536 to Lutfi Pasha, when he was Governor-General of Rumelia, states that tricksters claiming to be sons of cavalrymen may appear to demand Timars. In such a case, the order continues, 10 Timar holders should verify the claimant's identity. These rules aim to restrict entry to the class of Timar holders. Nonetheless, outsiders undoubtedly did acquire Timars, and there was a limited official recognition of their right to do so. Not all sons automatically qualified for a Timar on the death of their father. Those excluded could, however, acquire the right to a Timar before his death. Through voluntary service in the army, ordinary tax-paying subjects had no right at all to acquire Timars, but Lutfi Pasha provides evidence that, in fact, they did, when he lays down the guidelines for such awards. If an ordinary subject performs outstanding service and, by the increase in royal favor, receives a Timar and becomes a cavalryman, you should not offer protection to his relatives, father or mother. In principle, however, after the 1530s, accession to a fief followed. Strict rules. 42. Rules of succession required enforcement. This the Ottoman government sought to achieve by establishing procedures for recording and controlling appointments to Timars and Zemats. Some such system must have existed from the late 14th century, when the practice of drawing up registers evidently began, but it is only from the early 16th century onwards that records survive. It might take years for a person who qualified for a Timar actually to receive one, the conquest of new territory which made new lands available, or a war where large numbers of cavalrymen died, provided the best opportunities. The first stage in the process was for the Governor-General or Sanjak governor to draw up a list of candidates, and forward them in a sealed register to the Grand Vizier in Istanbul, or elsewhere if he was on campaign. The Imperial Council would then draw up a decree in the Sultan's name, ordering the Governor-General to award a Timar, and forward it to the candidate. The next stage was for the candidate to take the decree with his father's diploma of appointment to the Governor-General, who would then check the validity of the diploma or, if it was missing, look up his father's Timar in the register. The candidate had also to produce a witness or witnesses from the military class who could testify that he was the son of a cavalryman. The Governor-General would then, when one became available, confer a vacant Timar. This was not, however, the end of the process. If the Timar was in Rumelia and worth less than 6,000 akshas per year, in Anatolia and worth less than 5,000, or in the provinces of Karaman, Rum or Maras, and worth less than 3,000, then the Governor-General of the province could himself award the diploma of appointment. These were Timars without memorandum and apos. If, however, the Timar was worth more, the candidate had to acquire a sultanic diploma from Istanbul. The decree of 1531 to the Governor-General of Rumelia tightens the rules still further. From that date, all candidates receiving a fief for the first time required a diploma from the Sultan. It is doubtful, however, whether this rule was universally observed. For a candidate to acquire a sultanic diploma, the Governor-General had to write a memorandum naming the candidate, the witnesses, and designating the Timar, together with its value. If the diploma of the candidate's father was missing, he would write on the reverse, "The father's diploma, issued in such and such a year, is lost." The candidate had then, within 6 months, to exchange the Governor-General's memorandum for a sultanic diploma. This required him or his agent to travel to Istanbul, and to go to the office of the Controller of the Land Registry, where a clerk would copy the memorandum into the day book of Timar allocations in the appropriate sanjak. The office would also establish whether the value of the Timar, as it appeared in the memorandum, tallied with its value, as recorded in the summary register of Timars. If there was a discrepancy, the clerk would alter the memorandum to accord with the register. The office would also check to see whether the allocation would result in the division of the core of a fief. If it did so, the appointment was invalid. Once the checks were complete and the memorandum registered, it went to the chief clerk, who would authorize the issue of a diploma in the Sultan's name. The applicant could then take this and return to his Timar as a properly appointed cavalryman. 43. Once in possession of a Timar, a cavalryman had the opportunity to increase his income. Each Timar had an indivisible core of land and revenue. However, it was possible to add to this nucleus. To do so, a Timar holder would have to petition the Governor-General, Sanjak, Governor, or Zemat holding officer, who could present a petition on his behalf. After checking the records, the Controller of the Land Registry could then grant the increase. The greatest opportunity for acquiring supplements to a Timar was after a battle, when the Timars of the war dead became available. Indeed, clerks and registers accompanied the army on campaign, making it possible to redistribute Timars after an encounter with the enemy. The following, for example, is an entry granting a supplement to a Timar in a register made near the scene of action, immediately after the sea battle of Lepanto in 1571. Yalikabad, in the Sanjak of Kojele, the Timar of Ivas, comprising the village of Harmanli and others, worth 5,000 akshas per year. Daoud, who holds a Timar worth 3,000 akshas in the said district and is entitled to a Timar worth 7,000 akshas, has petitioned that the above named is dead and his Timar vacant, and has requested that it be allotted to himself. This has been decreed, with the 1,000 akshas surplus. 44. Not only could Timar holders achieve an increase in the value of their Timar, they could also lose it altogether. Before 1531, it appears that governors general on their own had the right to remove Timar holders. The decree of 1531, however, forbids them to attribute crimes to cavalrymen and to remove their Timars as punishment, stipulating that, in future, if a cavalryman committed an offense, the Governor-General should submit the facts to the Imperial Council, which would then take the decision on whether or not to confiscate documents from later in the 16th century, indicating that the Imperial Council reinstated cavalrymen whom Governor-Generals had removed without an order to do so, indicate that this is what happened in reality. Once deprived of his Timar, a cavalryman could join the ranks of tradesmen or, by attaching himself to the retinue of a Governor-General, hope to acquire a new Timar. The process of reinstatement is another matter which the decree of 1531 attempts to regulate. By the mid-16th century, therefore, the Sultan's government had devised procedures for controlling the allocation and tenure of Timars, and for determining the level of service which a cavalryman had to provide. The basis of the system was taxation of the peasantry, which the government sought to control, firstly by ensuring that the land remained under cultivation, and secondly by determining the rate of taxation. The status of the peasants on lands allocated as Timars must have varied from area to area, according to local practice and conditions. Nonetheless, certain rules which aimed to ensure that the land was under continuous cultivation seemed to have applied to peasants on Timars throughout the empire. Peasants were not, strictly speaking, bound to the soil, but in principle the law forbade them to leave the land uncultivated without paying compensation to the Timar holder. A law book of 1583 for a subdistrict of Shivas expresses this general concept, since it is an accepted custom for farm breakers' tax to be taken from those who abandon the land and follow another livelihood. This law is considered valid in the said subdistrict. 45 law books for other sanyaks provide more detail. A regulation dated 1539 for the Sanjak of Vais seems to be typical. If a peasant goes to another place, and it is more than 10 years since he left, and his landholding remains uncultivated, according to the law, his cavalryman should take farm breaker's tax from him. If it is less than 10 years, the cavalryman, with the cognizance of the judge of the time, should remove him and bring him back to his place. 46 In short, if a peasant let a plot lie fallow, he had either to return and cultivate it or, after a certain period, pay compensation. If, however, another cultivator took his place, he paid only the yoke tax on his plot for the year of his departure. The aim of the law was not so much to tie the peasant to the land, as to keep the land under cultivation. Other rules regulated the peasant's access to the land. A new entrant to a plot had to pay an entry fine to the Timar holder, and enjoyed security of tenure so long as he continued to cultivate his holding. If, however, he left it fallow for 3 years, the Timar holder had the right to expel him. The same rule could also apply if he converted arable to pasture, since pasture land is less productive of taxes, and conversion would result in loss of income for the Timar. Finally, peasant holdings were hereditary, but only from father to son. Daughters and other relatives could succeed, but only if the Timar holder considered them capable of cultivation and only if they paid an entry fine. 47. The purpose of these rules was to maximize the revenue coming from the land to the Timar holders, who were for the most part cavalrymen, and so to ensure the strength of the Sultan's army.